Hello everyone and welcome back. I'm Chuck, the Miniature Marauder, and on today's episode we're going to be talking about basing. Now, a few things I want to keep in mind here when I create my bases are that I want to keep the cost down. This means buying materials that I can use across any genre of miniature, whether they're fantasy, sci-fi, modern era. I want to choose materials that I can use to base any of those miniatures up that I can also buy in bulk, which helps me reduce the cost even further. So I've got a pretty adequate supply of some of the types of materials that I use, and I'll be showing you those today as I create a few different types of bases. Another way to keep the cost down is buying small bases in bulk. In this case, I'm actually moving away from just buying those black typical ones used for war games and using 3D printed bases. Now, you can find tons of these out there on Thingiverse. These ones are actually really awesome because it comes as a set of all the various common sizes that exist today. These were provided by a fellow painter, printer, and friend of mine who has a YouTube channel, Andy over at SinNerds. I'll make sure to have a link down below. He provided me these STL files so that I can test out these different bases. I can create some bases for some of my unbased miniatures that I have, and there's a lot of them. So I printed these up, about a dozen of them or so, in less than an hour, which is awesome. And they're a fraction of the cost of buying typical plastic ones off Amazon or wherever you typically get them. So super awesome. Today I'm going to be focusing on using these 40mm bases to create a few different textures and sceneries for you. Hopefully it'll give you some ideas and inspire you for how you can use these materials to create bases of your own. That said, hang out till after the break and we'll jump in. All right, since we have our bases here all ready to go, we're going to be using these 40mm bases, not the smaller ones. Some of the materials that we're going to be using are like these Vallejo texture paints, some natural play sand, and some coconut fibers that I've got pre-made here. You can, of course, decorate and add in any additional basing materials, tufts, grass, flocking, you name it. And the key adhesive I'm going to use is primarily PVA glues and Mod Podge. So for the first base, I'm going to put on a pretty tattered coat of the Vallejo earth texture. They make a lot of these different textures. There's like European thick mud, there's sands, you name it. Doesn't really matter which one you use because I'm going to prime the colors after. So just want this nice texture to be a little bit rocky and uneven using the texture gel. For the next base here, we're going to add a little bit of Mod Podge in, and this is going to be more of a basic base. I'm going to use the play sand here. Now this is natural play sand you can pick up from a hardware store. Make sure that it's natural play sand because you want there to be a lot of different texture pebbles and rocks, and it really just helps sell the scenery more when it's not all one same size consistent sand. For the third one, we're going to use Mod Podge again, and this one's going to make use of our coconut fiber. Now, the coconut fiber that I have, I pre-ground some of this up, but it actually came in a fully compressed brick. It's got all kinds of, the coconut little hairs in it, chunks. It adds some nice texture to it, and it's generally relatively soft. So once I put on my first coat of coconut fiber, I'm going to add a little bit more Mod Podge and then thicken it up with more fibers to give it a raised area. This stuff can be bought at any pet shop. You can buy it on Amazon. It's the stuff used for like lizard terrariums and things like that. So it's cheap and you can buy a lot of it for very little. To harden it up, I'm going to add a little bit of PVA watered down glue on top and let it dry for a little while. And while that's drying, we're going to go back to our Vallejo texture base here. And I'm just ripping up some small bits of cork to add some rocky bits. Adding a little bit of Mod Podge and then a mix of random static grass. I'm not going to use an applicator. I don't really need one for this. I just put it on very lightly and I tilt it to the side and tap it to make the grass kind of stand on end. It's also good to use different other types of shrubs. I have some of these tall standing sticks. They're from Green Stuff World, and it's basically a bunch of like reeds with leaves on them and such. So I'm going to put some of those just all over the place to add a little bit more variety of the shrubs that I have. This is always a really good idea because you want there to be a lot of different verdant types of life on your bases if you're creating a forest floor or a meadow or something like that. Here I'm just using a couple of very small pebbles that I have, and they're going to be just general rocks all around the base. So here they all are primed up. What I did was I just primed them all in black, and I gave them a small zenithal highlight over the top so that you can really see the texture stand out. If you wanted, you don't have to paint these. If you have all the right materials and the colors you're looking for, you can just leave them as is, but I wanted to paint them a very specific color using my airbrush. Jumping in here, I took an aqua green, bluish green color for the base, and I'm starting to spray what is going to be my more meadowy looking base. And I'm going to continuously bring up the highlights with brighter and brighter greenish colors before finally hitting it with a yellow. For the earth texture around, I'm going to be using a brownish red to make the dirt itself stand out a little bit more, add a little bit more depth to it. And then I'll clean up a little bit more around the actual shrub and bushes itself. And as you can see, it's coming along pretty nicely, looking just like a patch of wild growing plants. I'm a big fan of Vallejo pigments, and for most of these bases I'm actually using some oxide and some brown earth pigments. And all you have to do is put your brush in, get a little on the brush, and then smear it around and just kind of lightly pat it around the base. And when it's all said and done, you can seal this using your Duracoat, your Tester's Duracoat, or whatever you have to lock it into place. Now this is where we're going to use some gamer grass that I happen to be using, but any tufts that you have will do. I'm getting some that have some really funky colors to them. This one has a bluish green to it, and I'm going to add in a couple of other colors, darker, lighter. You want this to be a good mix because nature is chaotic and everything's not always going to be the same, so I want this to look kind of wild and overgrown in this little meadow patch. And as you can see, I'm using some tweezers and I'm just dabbing it in some Mod Podge, and I'm just gluing it together. I'm also going back and I'm using some of my Green Stuff World reeds that I had because I wanted something with some sticks in it to stand up and look like it's kind of bursting out of the ground like a weed. And here's kind of a rough look at the base. It's going to dry for a little bit, but I think overall it is a really fine looking little meadow overgrown base. The next one here, I wanted to have some rocks in it and a little bit of elevation. So I'm going to follow suit and do it in a similar fashion where I'm using a base around where the grass is and everything to be a bluish looking green. And once again, we're going to try to bring this up using a few other greens. Doesn't really matter which ones you use. I usually just grab them, and whatever one goes from darkest to lightest works out really well. And I'm just going to go all the way around. It's okay to spray the more mossy looking greens on the rocks because that's the effect I really want to go for. I'm going to be taking a brown and filling in dark brown on the dirt, on some of the rocks, and then I'm going to do the same thing like I did on the grass, bringing that brown all the way up to a brighter looking color to add highlight to those rocks. And I want it to have more of a natural, dirty, stony looking color. And don't be afraid to go over this as many times as you need to. If you're new to airbrushing, there might be some overspray where you get a color onto another component you didn't intend to. That's fine. Again, you can go in, play with it a little bit, overspray, go back, repair it, and just tinker with it until you get an effect that you really, really like. For me, after I did the dirt, I oversprayed the dirt a little bit, and I went back and brought up a little bit of the green before I was happy with it. The last step here is using some of the Vallejo pigments that I have and going all around wherever the dirt is and on some of the underside of the rock. And I'm mixing in more of an oxide color with a very light gray color on top of the stones to, again, bring out those highlights a little bit more. And as you can see, it comes out really nice looking. I've got nice green bits of area, some mossy looking rock, and it has more of a natural effect, which is exactly what I was going for. This last one is the easiest of them all. All I'm going to do here is put down multiple layers of browns and bring it up to a reddish looking color. So I'm putting on some very beige colors here. You can use like an Ushabti bone from Games Workshop or something similar. And then once that's down, I'm going to heavily, aggressively dry brush this in an antique / an off-white color. Doesn't matter how unclean it is, because again, you're going to be now going over it with your Vallejo pigments. This is an oxide pigment, but I'm going to use some darker and some lighter colors to make it look a little bit more like a natural earth scene, because it's not all going to be one color. So here's the final pieces that we have, and I think they came out really beautifully. I mean, this was a project that took me well under an hour to do, and bear in mind I was filming and doing all of that, so if you've got a lot of basing you need to do, you can do a ton of it really quickly just by using some natural play sand, some coconut fiber, and a little bit of some store-bought stuff like the Vallejo gels. I think between all of these options, you should have enough in your inventory to be able to build any kind of base that you want, whether it's something like this where it's a rocky outcropping with a lot of natural tones to it, to something that's a little bit more basic like a dirt road or just a general patch of grass or something like that. Having a bit of variety and adding a bit more texture into your bases helps them look a little bit more realistic, and also makes a good final piece without stealing any of the character away from your actual painted models. You always want your base to complement your models and not steal the show entirely. If you have a very beautifully painted mini, you don't want to overdo it by having a more beautiful looking base. Thank you all again for taking the time to check out my video. If you'd like to see more content like this, be sure to hit that bell to be notified every time I release a new video. And of course, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below to let me know your thoughts. Thank you all again, and we'll catch you in the next video.